If you've been following my story, you'll know I'm a recent Anglican convert to the Catholic Church. Some of you may know my former church as the Episcopal Church if you live in the US. Around the world, Anglicanism goes by different names depending on the country. In England, it's called the Church of England. There's the Anglican Church of Canada, the Anglican Church of Australia. In Scotland, it's the Scottish Episcopal Church. In Ireland, it's the Church of Ireland, the Church of Nigeria, the Anglican Church of Kenya, and the Church of the Province of Uganda. Today, some of the largest Anglican populations in the world are found in African countries. For example, the Church of Nigeria alone is estimated to have over 20 million members, making it one of the largest, if not the largest, Anglican churches globally. I thought Anglicanism was basically Catholicism without the Pope, but apparently that's wrong, but also kind of true. If you know anything about this Protestant tradition, you'll know that it started with a man named Henry VIII. England changed religions multiple times in one century depending on who sat on the throne, which is honestly insane, starting with Henry VIII. So I wanted to understand what actually happened, because as a practicing Anglican, a lot of this never fully made sense to me. There's a lot of questions we need to cover to really understand what happened and how this divide caused even more fractures, or what us Catholics like to call schisms. Who was Henry VIII, and what actually caused England to separate from the Catholic Church? Did Henry VIII actually want Protestantism? Was he even a Protestant himself? Why did the Pope refuse the annulment? How did England's religion keep changing under Henry's children? Why do Anglican churches still look and feel so Catholic today? And what do Catholics and Anglicans still agree on, and where do they fundamentally differ? And why are so many Anglicans converting to Catholicism today? Welcome to Baby Catholic. So, starting with the first question, who was Henry VIII, and what was the real reason he separated England from the Catholic Church? So to start, we need to understand England before the split from Rome. England was fully Catholic for centuries. The Pope had authority over the English Church. Monasteries were extremely powerful religious and economic institutions. The Church owned massive amounts of land throughout England. The Catholic Church reportedly controlled around 20 to 30% of England's land and wealth. At the time, England was officially a Catholic nation, and openly rejecting the Catholic teaching could lead to charges of heresy. However, during the early 1500s, a group of scholars and clergy at Cambridge University became interested in Protestant ideas coming from continental Europe. They met at a tavern in Cambridge to discuss theology, church reform, and the writings of reformers like Martin Luther. Because so many of their ideas were influenced by Lutheran thought coming out of Germany, the group was nicknamed Little Germany. One of these members were Thomas Cranmer, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury from 1533 to 1555. We'll come back to him later. Henry VIII was the King of England from April 22nd, 1509, officially beginning his reign the day after his father's death, until his own death on January 28, 1547. Only weeks after taking the throne, the 17-year-old king married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, in 1509. The accession of Henry VIII to the throne was widely welcomed as a young, energetic new beginning for England. He was seen as athletic, intelligent, charismatic, and highly educated. He was known for jousting, hunting, music, languages, and the people viewed him as a sharp contrast to his more cautious father, Henry VII. Early in his reign, Henry VIII was extremely popular and admired both in England and across Europe. Henry VIII earned the title Defender of the Faith from Pope Leo X in 1521. Henry wrote a book defending the Catholic Church against Martin Luther, who had started the Protestant Reformation. The book was called Assertio Septem Sacramentum. I'll work on my Latin, but it's defense of the seven sacraments. In it, Henry strongly defended the Pope, Catholic sacraments, traditional Catholic teachings, especially against Luther's attacks. The irony, of course, is that only a few short years later, Henry would break from Rome himself, which makes this title incredibly ironic. Even stranger, the title is still used today by British monarchs. Queen Elizabeth II used it, Charles uses it today. In fact, every English and later British monarch had carried this title since Henry, with one exception of Mary I of England, who we will get back to later. A title originally given to Henry for defending Catholic teaching and tradition is still attached to the monarchy that eventually separated from Rome. Almost everyone who has heard anything about the beginning of the Anglican Church knows that Henry VIII left because he wanted a divorce. But most people know almost nothing beyond that. So let's get back to his marriage at 17 to his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was a Spanish princess, deeply Catholic, just like Henry, married to Henry for more than 20 years. And she was the mother to Mary I of England. During their marriage, Henry became desperate for a male heir. Back then, biology and genetics were not understood the way they are today. Many people believed that the woman's body determined the gender of the baby, which led women to sometimes being blamed or discarded for not producing male heirs. We now have an understanding that that assumption was most likely incorrect, as we believe the father's chromosomes determine the baby's sex, not the mother's. And unfortunately for Henry, you can't simply discard a Spanish princess without risking major political consequences or even war. So he turned to the Pope seeking an annulment. Ironically, this was not Henry's first conversation with the Pope about the marriage, because he had originally needed papal permission to marry Catherine in the first place after the death of his brother Arthur. Why did the Pope refuse the annulment? Henry's argument was that Catherine of Aragon had previously been married to Henry's brother, and that marrying his brother's widow violated biblical law. He used verses like Leviticus 20:21 to argue that the marriage should never have happened in the first place. Earlier, however, the Pope had granted special permission, known as a dispensation, allowing Henry to marry Catherine after Arthur had died. So now Henry was basically asking, can the church undo what it has already approved? That created a huge theological problem. The big political problem is that Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, who was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe at the time, politically and militarily dominant. So when Henry wanted the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine, the Pope was in an extremely difficult position. Angering Charles V, whose troops had recently devastated Rome during the sack of Rome, could have been very dangerous. So the Pope delayed and resisted the annulment, partially because of massive political pressure, not just theology. Instead of outright saying, absolutely not, the Pope delayed proceedings and avoided final decisions. Henry became furious. Eventually, Henry decided that if the Pope would not approve the annulment, England would separate from papal authority entirely. That led to the Act of Supremacy in 1534, making Henry head of the Church of England. This is the official narrative, but I believe we're leaving out some truth in this romanticized story. Before we get into that, let's introduce the rest of the wives. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife. He married her in 1533 after breaking from Rome. She was the mother of Elizabeth I and later arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Lady Greensleeves, or the woman who changed everything, the one Henry supposedly couldn't live without, and who had helped cause the Great Matter, was beheaded in 1536 at the Tower of London. Most historians believe that many or all of her charges against her were fabricated or politically motivated. Personally, I don't think Henry wanted to wait much longer for a male heir, and the birth of Elizabeth I was most likely a major disappointment to him. because he was already looking for someone else who could give him a son. That brings us to Jane Seymour. She married Henry VIII shortly after the execution of his previous wife in 1536 and gave birth to Henry's long-awaited son, Edward VI, in 1537. Henry reportedly considered her his true wife, and out of all the wives, he later chose to be buried beside her. Unfortunately, Jane Seymour died only a couple of weeks after childbirth due to complications. The next wife was Anne of Cleves. This was a political marriage, arranged with a German princess named Anne. They married on January 6, 1540, but the marriage was annulled just 6 months later, after Henry claimed he was not attracted to her. According to the official story, the marriage was never fully consummated, and they separated relatively peacefully, at least compared to his other marriages. Anne survived Henry and remained respected in England. The next wife was Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard married Henry VIII on July 28, 1540, just 19 days after his marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled. She was much younger than Henry, and after they had married, her romantic past and sexual relationships before the marriage came to light. She was also accused of adultery during the marriage and was beheaded for treason in 1542. Jane Boleyn, the sister-in-law of Anne Boleyn, was implicated in helping arranging some of these meetings, and she was also executed. That brings us to Henry's final wife, Catherine Parr. Yes, half of Henry's wives were named Catherine, as it was an extremely popular name in royal and noble circles at the time. She was intelligent, highly educated, and reportedly helped reconcile Henry with his daughters Mary and Elizabeth. She also had Protestant leanings. Henry and Catherine were married in 1543 until Henry's death in 1547. As a side note, just to keep things fair and honest about the time period and the people involved, Catherine Parr was Henry's sixth wife, but Henry was actually her third of 4 husbands in total. When spouses passed away, remarriage was often common, especially among royalty, where marriage was deeply tied to politics, survival, inheritance, and social status. And to be fair to Catherine, none of her husbands were beheaded by her hand either. She had ultimately survived Henry. During Henry VIII's reign as leader of his church and king of his country, he actually stayed surprisingly Catholic in many of his beliefs, which makes sense considering he held the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope. And remember, it was the Catholic faith he was defending. He believed in the Catholic Church. His break from Rome was primarily about his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and his desire for a male heir, not originally about Protestant doctrine. He still believed in the Mass, purgatory, confession, clerical celibacy. He never legalized priests marrying during his reign. He punished those who denied the Mass, sometimes burning them, while Catholics who rejected his authority as supreme head of the church were also executed. When he died, he reportedly requested for masses said for his soul, last rites, and prayers for the dead. In many ways, he died looking far more Catholic than many people realize. A terrible Catholic, you could argue, maybe one of the worst. Pride is one of the most dangerous sins because it can convince people they alone should decide truth and authority. And because of all of this, I don't think anyone could argue that Henry VIII intended everything that eventually followed within his church to happen. The Anglican community today has become far broader and more theologically diverse than Henry likely ever imagined. In my opinion, based on historical facts, Henry VIII seemed to want a level of religious authority for himself that had previously belonged to the Pope in England. While historians would not technically call him an anti-pope, I would say he was more like a mini anti-pope or on his way to becoming one. He did break England from Rome and declared himself as supreme head of the Church of England in 1534, giving the English crown major control over the religion within the country. Henry VIII also had strong ambitions to expand England's power and territory, especially in France. He wanted to restore England's military dominance abroad. Early in his reign, he launched invasions into France. Historians often described him as driven by glory, conquest, and desire to make England a major European power. You can also point to Ireland as an example of Henry extending both political and religious control. After breaking from Rome, Henry increased English authority over Ireland in 1541, declaring himself King of Ireland. The English government then began pushing the Protestant reform into Ireland under the English rule, even though most of the Irish population remained Catholic. This became the beginning of centuries of religious and political conflict between English rule and a largely Catholic Ireland. So, did Henry VIII actually want Protestantism, and was he even a Protestant himself? Well, considering how he died and how many Catholic beliefs and practices he kept in place, I don't think he was the passionate, bleeding heart Protestant reformer people sometimes make him out to be. During much of his reign, the church services, bishops, sacraments, and many core doctrines still looked very Catholic. So if the beginning of the church wasn't really about theology, but was it really about papacy and being able to love who you want? Or was it something much bigger, something else? Remember, Henry was a smart man. Although flawed in many ways, he was also an opportunist, and he successfully pulled off one of the greatest land looting heists in history. And we don't give him enough credit. I would like to formally ensure people understand the truth, which is that he was responsible for tens of thousands of innocent people's lives in his own country. In fact, some estimates suggest that as many as 70,000 people may have died during the reign of Henry VIII. This number is disputed, and the higher estimates, historians often want to clarify that there were not only executions, but also deaths connected to rebellions, famine, imprisonment, unrest during the English Reformation. Historians generally agree that thousands were executed or killed during Henry's reign, including Catholics who remained loyal to Rome, Protestant reformers Henry considered too radical, and those accused of treason against the crown. So let's make sure we give Henry VIII credit for the enormous impact he had on England. He expanded the English navy, reshaped the structure of the Church of England by separating from the Pope. He helped pave the way for the English Bible, influenced government and parliamentary reform, supported the arts, remodeled royal palaces across England, and he became the King of Ireland, whatever that means. But his reign also led to the destruction of the monasteries, religious persecution, executions, devastation of countless families throughout his own kingdom. You could argue he's one of the most destructive rulers in English Christian history. Yet somehow his daughter, Mary I of England, became remembered forever as Bloody Mary. And he was credited with building a church, and most likely because he could steal 20 to 30% of the land controlled by Rome. I'd also like to take a minute and speak about Thomas More. Thomas More was an English lawyer, writer, and close advisor to Henry VIII, who stayed loyal to the Catholic Church during the English split from Rome. He refused to accept Henry as the head of the Church of England or supported the king's annulment, and he was executed for treason in 1535. Catholics consider him a martyr because he chose faithfulness to the Pope and the Catholic teaching, even though it cost him his life, which is why he later was canonized as a saint. His Catholic feast day is celebrated on June 22nd alongside with John Fisher, another martyr executed during the same conflict with Henry VIII. Interestingly, he is also honored within the Church of England, and his feast day for the Anglican Church is the day he was killed, July 6, which is traditional, however confusing, as that is the church to kill poor Thomas More. So I'm going to leave it there. I hope I covered enough basic history to help explain where the Church of England actually came from and why the split from the Catholic Church was so much more complicated than just Henry wanted a divorce. But honestly, the real religious chaos was just beginning, because after Henry's death, England's future would be placed into the hands of his children. And somehow, within one family, the country would swing from Protestant to Catholic to Protestant again in barely a generation. So in the next episode, we're diving into the succession crisis after Henry VIII and how his children completely reshaped Christianity in England forever. Thank you for watching Baby Catholic.